You start, okay, sure.
Good afternoon, everyone. I don't have a microphone, so I hope you can all hear me. Or I can use a microphone. Good afternoon. My name is Liza Goitin. Along with my colleague Faiza Patel, we are co-directors of the Liberty and National Security Program at the Brennan Center for Justice. Welcome. We're so pleased to have you all at this event, and for those of you who had to actually leave the building to get here, thank you for making the trip on this not-so-pleasant DC afternoon. We're very excited about the report that we're releasing today, Domestic Intelligence, New Powers, New Risks, authored by my colleague, Emily Berman. And we're looking forward to a lively panel discussion. So I will turn it over very soon to our esteemed moderator. First, I wanted to point out some people in the audience. First, I understand that Congressman Scott is here. And thank you very much, Congressman. It's wonderful to see you here.
I'll trade.
And I wanted to also introduce some Brennan Center colleagues. In addition to Faiza Patel, who I mentioned, who's here in the front row, we also have our Director of Communications, Janine Plant-Sherlin. And I think that the director of our DC office, she might not have made it yet, Nicole Austin Hillary will be here shortly. If you have any questions about the work of the Brennan Center, feel free to talk to any of us after the event. So without further ado, enjoy the panel. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you all for being here. My name is Michael Isikoff. I am a correspondent with NBC News, formerly a correspondent with Newsweek, and before that with the Washington Post. And I am very delighted to be here and chair what I think is an important panel. This is a subject, the broad subject of civil liberties in the war on terror was something that was at the forefront of a lot of national debate throughout the Bush years. The Patriot Act, the terrorist surveillance program, all these were sort of front and center issues. And they seem to have faded a bit from the headlines, but that doesn't make them any less important for issues that are front and center in the national agenda, which is how to address the problems of national security problems, particularly domestically, on the terrorist front, and still adhere to our values. So that's broadly going to be discussion. We're going to be talking in particular about the very interesting report that Emily Berman has put together, and we have a very distinguished panel to do so. Congressman Rush Holt from New Jersey, a member of the House Intelligence Committee, at least in the last couple of sessions. I just was informed that the Democratic membership of this year's panel has not yet been appointed, so he doesn't know, or at least to Congressman Holt's knowledge, so he doesn't know if he will be serving once again on that panel. Among his many distinctions, the one that was the most impressive to me is he is the only physicist in the Congress, and so if there are any physicist issues that come up, we'll know exactly who to ask them to. Emily Berman is counsel in the Liberty and National Security Program at the Brennan Center for Justice at the NYU School of Law. She is the author of the report. She works through litigation advocacy and scholarship to promote rights, protecting, and effective oversight of U.S. national security policy. Also on the panel, David Gartenstein-Ross, who is director for the Center for the Study of Terrorist Radicalization at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, who, as I understand it, might be offering some different perspectives than some of the other speakers today. And Shahid Buttar is executive director of the Bill of Rights Defense Committee. Cutting right to the chase, I think we're going to start with Congressman Holt and then let Emily talk about her report and take it from there. Congressman.
Oh, I stay here because that's where the microphone is. Okay.
Yeah.
That's all right.
Is this microphone on? Good. All right, thanks. And thanks to the Brennan Center for really all the good work that the Brennan Center does, but especially for keeping the focus on what, as Michael, I think, rightly points out, subjects that have slipped a little bit from the spotlight in recent years. It's not a new topic, but the problem certainly deserves attention, and I applaud the Brennan Center for bringing it to public attention. Last month, I learned that the Bureau was in the process of updating its Domestic Investigations and Operations Guide, the so-called DIOG. And one of my concerns in reviewing this update, was what might come to be an emphasis on the use of race, religion, ethnicity in initiating investigations. And it appears my concerns were justified, as when I perused the DIOG, I found on page 32 that, quote, "The DOJ guidance and FBI policy permit the FBI to identify locations of concentrated ethnic communities in the field office's domain if these locations will reasonably aid the analysis of potential threats and vulnerability and overall assist domain awareness for the purpose of performing intelligence analysis. If, for example, intelligence reporting reveals that members of certain terrorist organizations live and operate primarily within a certain concentrated community of the same ethnicity, the location of that community is clearly valuable and properly collectible data. Similarly, the locations of ethnic-oriented businesses and other facilities may be collected if their locations will reasonably contribute to an awareness of threats and vulnerabilities and intelligence collection opportunities." Now, that passage from the DIOG appears to presume that potential terrorist attackers of a given ethnic or racial group will most likely be found living in a community with those of the same ethnic or racial composition. Now, this was not the case in many of the 9/11 hijackers. It was not the case in Major Nidal Hassan. It was not the case with Adam Guyton. It was not. Well, profiling on the basis of race or religion is not simply wrong from a civil liberties perspective. It indicates lazy, careless thinking about a problem. There are other matters that Emily will turn to, I think. I find it particularly troubling that this seems to be leading to a weakening of procedural safeguards, and it allows conducting interviews under false pretenses with the presumed explanation that, these are ruthless people we're dealing with here that we have to find, and therefore we have to use ruthless methods. Putting aside the dehumanizing and intimidating problems that come from ruthless methods, I'd like to talk about the fallacious practices, the fallacious reasoning that is behind this. We should, in 5th grade, begin to teach the idea of base rates. It is, some doctors eventually learn that if a test is 90% specific and 90% sensitive, then you might get 10 times as many false positives as real positives. And that 90% of the people who are then told that they have tested positive for whatever the rare disease is that there's a 10-to-1 chance that they don't actually have it. Profiling is lazy thinking. And when we read the Constitution on the floor, some of the Constitution on the floor of the House recently, I wanted, when we got to the Fourth Amendment, to ask my colleagues to pause and think just how extraordinarily insightful the authors were. How good an understanding of human nature they had when they said, if you have to prove to an independent person that you know what you're doing, you will do a better job. False positives are not without cost. A lack of proper investigative standards have led the Bureau to conduct surveillance of completely peaceful domestic groups who happen to oppose our country's involvement in wars, for example. The Inspector General last September the DOJ Inspector General issued a report on several incidents involving FBI surveillance of anti-war and other political groups. Surveillance actions that in several specific cases showed the FBI agents and supervisors directed surveillance in the absence of a credible connection to a terrorist threat. In the case of surveillance of individuals associated with the Thomas Merton Center in Pittsburgh, the Inspector General noted, quote, taking all the evidence together, we concluded that Agent Berry was sent to the event pursuant to a casual spur-of-the-moment assignment given in substantial part because Berry was a probationary agent with nothing to do on a slow work day, the day after Thanksgiving. We believe that Berry was told to look for terrorism subjects at the event, but we could not find any particularized basis for the FBI to believe that any terrorism subject would be in attendance. We believe that the surveillance was an ill-considered make-work assignment. Now, I think we need to evidently teach FBI agents the base rate fallacy in logical thinking also. The IG goes on. In short, we found that the FBI made a series of misleading and inaccurate statements to Congress and the law about the circumstances surrounding the Pittsburgh Field Division surveillance of the Merton Center anti-war rally. The IG also noted that the factual basis for, quote, the factual basis for opening some of the investigations of individuals affiliated with the groups was factually weak. Moreover, in several cases, there was little indication of any possible federal crimes as opposed to state crimes. In some cases, the IG, quote, also found that the FBI extended the duration of the investigations involving advocacy groups and their members without adequate basis, and in a few instances, the FBI improperly retained information about the groups in its files. In some cases, the FBI classified some investigations related to nonviolent civil disobedience under its acts of terrorism classification. I think I'll leave it to the Brennan Center to say more about why fallacious thinking is not just insulting or dehumanizing, but actually can make us less safe. I do want to mention before I give up the microphone that in about a month, 3 existing provisions of the Patriot Act are set to expire. The so-called lone wolf surveillance provision, the roving wiretap authority, and what's known as the Section 215, referred to sometimes as the librarian's provision, even though the statute makes no mention of libraries as potential targets of requests under the law. An extension, I raise this issue simply to bring it to your attention because I think people who care about these things have their work cut out for them in the next month. And I hope some of you are among those. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Anyone?
So first, I'd like to thank Representative Holt, Michael Isikoff, David, and Shahid for coming today, and for all of you for coming to listen. I'm going to talk for just a few minutes about the report itself and some of the findings in it and the recommendations that it makes. So just by way of background, the Attorney General's guidelines were originally implemented to prevent the recurrence of the 1960s era widespread FBI intelligence collection on Americans. And they aim to do that by limiting the FBI's intelligence collection role and trying to ensure that FBI activities were tied closely to impending wrongdoing or violence or threats of some kind. Over time, the guidelines have evolved and gone through a series of revisions. And throughout these revisions, including the latest one in December of 2008, implemented by then Attorney General Michael Mukasey, there have been 4 consistent trends in the changes to the guidelines. The first is that the necessary connection between an investigation and criminal activity has become more and more attenuated, so that tie between FBI activities and impending crime has gotten further and further apart. The FBI also needs less evidence to initiate investigations and to advance investigations to the next stage. Third, the more intrusive investigative techniques are being permitted at earlier and earlier stages of investigations. And oversight mechanisms such as durational limits on investigations or requirements for getting supervisors' approval for various tactics have been rolled back or eliminated entirely. So that's been a trend really since the Reagan administration, essentially. But in addition to these trends, the Mukasey guidelines also implement a new investigative phase called an assessment. And an assessment can be initiated when there's absolutely no individualized suspicion or indication of wrongdoing whatsoever. But even while there's no proof of wrongdoing needed to initiate an assessment, at the same time they permit highly intrusive investigative techniques. So the government can send informants into political meetings or religious services. They can pretend to be a new neighbor or business associate in order to ask your friends and colleagues about you. And they can engage in physical surveillance of unlimited durations. They could follow someone day and night. And this is with no evidence of wrongdoing or threat. So the driving force, I think, it's pretty much agreed for both the changes in the Mukasey guidelines and the trends that I mentioned before, is the increased focus on intelligence collection as a means of preventing crime, and particularly terrorism. And this is no secret. The guidelines themselves declare that the FBI is an intelligence agency as well as a law enforcement agency, and that its role includes analysis of information to identify and understand trends, causes, and potential indicia of threats. But to perform this role and to have information to analyze, the FBI has to collect, retain, and study vast amounts of information. And so in our mind, this intelligence collection mandate combined with the increasing permissiveness of the guidelines raises some concerns. The first concern is simply about Americans' privacy. If the FBI is permitted to engage in widespread collection of information about Americans, absent any indication of wrongdoing, threat, or foreign intelligence activity, that's likely to lead to invasions of privacy. Second, there's a threat of chill to First Amendment protected activity. And among other issues here, we've already seen that widespread use of informants in mosques, for example, has reportedly affected religious dialogue within houses of worship, and charitable giving and attendance at services have fallen as well. The next threat is the risk of profiling. Representative Holt mentioned that earlier, and I do think it's a concern, particularly when investigative decisions are not constrained by the need to point to evidence. Profiling becomes much more likely. And finally, and potentially paradoxically, I think there are two ways in which the guidelines make law enforcement less effective than it could be. The first is a community relations issue. I mentioned informants in mosques, and I know that the perception in large parts of the American Muslim community is that that community has been singled out as suspect and targeted for surveillance in disproportionate measure. And that perception has created a tension between that community and law enforcement, where what we need for effective counterterrorism policy is a cooperative relationship there. And then the other concern about the efficacy of the guidelines is the risk of simply over-collecting information. I'm sure many of you saw the Washington Post series they called Top Secret America, that found that so many reports using information gathered through various surveillance techniques are published that many are routinely ignored. So if we're paying people to generate intelligence reports that are ignored, then arguably that's not the best use of our counterterrorism resources. So I do want to pause here and say that I have no question that members of the FBI are acting in good faith to do their jobs as best they can. They've got an incredibly difficult job, and they're expected, unrealistically in my view, to be 100% effective in preventing terrorism. But when you combine the broad investigative authority that they've been given with an expectation of complete prevention, that creates an intense pressure to engage in broad and perhaps overbroad intelligence collection. So appropriate limits and enforcement of those limits becomes all the more important. So what to do? The report recommends two types of reforms. The first set of reforms focus on increased oversight of the use of the guidelines. And I think it's important to, when talking about oversight, that we should not only be looking at oversight of any civil liberties areas that we might be concerned about, but also oversight of whether the guidelines are working. Are they allowing law enforcement to locate and stop terrorist threats, or are they sending them on wild goose chases that would be that a more targeted approach would work better? And then also I think there are two substantive areas where the rules of the guidelines should simply be changed. The first is that the FBI should not be allowed to use the highly intrusive investigative techniques that are permitted at the assessment stage without any suspicion of wrongdoing. And then I also think that the improper consideration of race, religion, ethnicity, national origin, or other First Amendment protected activities should be barred from playing a role in investigative decisions. And instead, the FBI should adopt what's often referred to as a behavior-focused approach to identifying suspicious activity. This is what the Office of the Director of National Intelligence has done, and the FBI should follow suit. So I think I'll stop there. I'm happy to talk in more detail about the report or its recommendations or anything else people are curious about, but for now, I look forward to hearing other perspectives and the discussion.
Aviv?
So in reviewing past FBI abuses, or in Emily's phraseology, misplaced domestic intelligence efforts, the report twice singles out the same Cold War era effort, which is called the Library Awareness Program. As the report recounts, this program included regular FBI visits to public libraries, seeking information regarding individuals who read scientific and technical journals, sometimes asking librarians to be wary of foreigners or persons with East European or Russian-sounding names. Now, on its face, this of course seems absurd. A blanket suspicion of foreigners looking for scientific or technical information. But what the report doesn't mention is that during this period, in the 1980s, there was a man named Mahdi Obeidi who was doing exactly that. Obeidi was Saddam Hussein's chief nuclear scientist, and he was charged with rejuvenating Iraq's nuclear weapons program after Israel destroyed its nuclear reactor in Tammuz in 1981. Thereafter, Saddam Hussein fixated on designing a nuclear program that could easily resist the kind of attack that destroyed his previous reactor. He settled on centrifuge technology, which creates great centrifugal force by rotating at extremely high speeds, thus separating heavier uranium-238 isotopes from lighter uranium-235 isotopes. After the uranium-238 has been drawn out, the highly enriched uranium remaining at the center can be siphoned away. They're easy to hide, easy to protect against attack. Now, Obeidi, in a book he later wrote called The Bomb in My Garden, talks about how he was able to create a working prototype of a centrifuge by 1991, by the time that the first Gulf War had happened. A large part of the research involved traveling through the United States to glean the requisite knowledge from scientists who naively were trusting, who couldn't possibly think within their frame of reference that this could be a man who was serving as an agent of a foreign government, getting technical information for the nuclear program. And in fact, he got a key piece of information from a technical section of the library at the University of Virginia. In an extended passage, he explains how he asked a librarian if he could see a key report on centrifuge technology called the Zippe report. Asked to fill out a lengthy form and provide identification, Obeidi instead said, "Would it be possible to ensure that the report is indeed here before I fill out all these forms?" So the librarian brought him the report and insisted that Obeidi fill out the forms for security reasons before he read it. Obeidi was hesitant to do so and asked, "Well, could I see it for a moment to be sure that it's the right document?" There, in front of the librarian, he flipped through the report. Eventually, he found an appendix at the end, which listed the names of all the recipients of the report when it was first published in 1960. After seeing those names, he recognized one of them, an Italian scientist from whom he was able to obtain the Zippe report. Now, the point of this extended discussion is this. The FBI's concern about foreign visitors examining technical and scientific journals in U.S. libraries was not misplaced. In fact, key technical information that a foreign agent gleaned from a U.S. library proved central to the astounding development of Iraq's nuclear program in the 1980s. And what this tells us is that context is key when determining if a provision is an unjust provision or one that serves a legitimate focus. So I think that this report makes a contribution, a real contribution, and touches on very legitimate issues. As such, I'm honored to be a member of the panel. I thank Emily and the Brennan Center for letting me play a role in this, but as framed earlier, I'm the dissenting voice on this panel. Not in that nothing should be changed, but rather in that there are aspects of this report that don't persuade me that the case for change has been made. In particular, I want to single out a few areas where I'm skeptical. We'll begin with where Emily just left off. I don't buy the idea that this report both improves our liberties and also actually makes us safer. It argues that it does so in two ways. By reducing the deluge of information that right now our analysts can't handle, and by harmonizing relations between the Muslim community and law enforcement. These arguments to me don't quite add up. The first one makes a true point. It's true that analysts have trouble keeping up with the volume of threat reporting that's out there. There, after all, is a lot of it. But that doesn't mean that depriving them of information automatically improves analytic efforts, nor does it mean that the information that this report would deny the FBI is the exact information that they don't need. The question you need to ask instead is the information that you're taking away truly unnecessary, or are you depriving law enforcement of information that it needs in order to do its job? The arguments on this point make me a bit uncomfortable, given the lack of apparent contribution of law enforcement into making this report. The idea that we know exactly what we have to deprive the FBI of to make them do their job better. To be frank, it conjures up kind of a cartoonish image of a bumbling, incompetent FBI that isn't an FBI that I know in my experience in dealing with them. And the response, of course, is that we will be more effective because profiling always fails. Now, I'll get to that in a second because that's one of the key disputes on this panel. For the second argument, with respect to harmonization with the Muslim community, that is a very, very important goal. Pause for water. It's a very important goal. I'm not sure that this would improve harmonization. I'm not sure that it wouldn't. But also it seems to me that there are other ways besides reducing FBI investigative authority that you can harmonize relations. In particular, training on the issue and strong directives dealing with how to approach investigations. We could have a much more extended discussion of this, but I don't think that this is the exact thing that's needed to address that issue. But let's turn to the issue of profiling. When people think profiling, and that seems to be a lot of the discussion of profiling here, they tend to think, looking at a factor like race or religion and using that as a proxy for suspicion. The question I would pose is, can factors singled out by this report and singled out by Representative Holt and Emily as being particularly problematic, such as religion, race, ethnicity, national origin, and protected First Amendment activities, can they be relevant factors in law enforcement investigations? Nobody in this panel is arguing that you should have blanket suspicion over a community. You shouldn't, period. But it's clear to me that these factors are not irrelevant when you're undertaking policing efforts. And the examples in the report of abuses in which profiling was attempted, in fact, show what happens when you have a crisis and you have insufficient information. One striking example is the post-9/11 measures that the FBI implemented, interviewing thousands of people of Arab and Muslim descent immediately after the attacks. What they're a product of is an agency that's worried that there could be a follow-on attack and does not have the information to know who to talk to, who to be suspicious of, and the like. What it shows is a failure of information, not a deluge of information at that point in time. I want to give some concrete examples as to when a profile of one of these factors becomes relevant. One example, a Muslim psychiatrist in the US military is found to be in communication with a high-profile terrorist recruiter in Yemen. The psychiatrist has also given several presentations to his chain of command outlining his view of Islam. Is profiling these views, that is, looking at what his presentations had said to see whether they map with what some people dub the Salafi jihadi interpretation of the faith, is that a legitimate use of profiling? Second, a college dropout in Arizona is posting messages on extreme right-wing websites. He has a great amount of anti-government anger, and in particular, towards his district's congresswoman. So, this is protected by the First Amendment. His views seem to map with those of the Christian identity movement, which is a racist apocalyptic movement. Is profiling his protected religious views and his protected First Amendment views something that is legitimate to see whether he poses a threat? And third, there's a jihadist website, which this report holds shouldn't be profiled in two ways. First, the site itself contains religious content, and second, the speech on the website, let us stipulate, though it's extremely anti-US, falls short of incitement, thus it's protected by the First Amendment. Should investigators be able to chat with individuals on that website to determine whether, given where they are, they might actually be interested in carrying out attacks? Now, this last one is a form of profiling, which seems prohibited to me by the report's recommendations, in that the first recommendation Emily puts forward is to prohibit the FBI from posing as other people and recruiting informants to glean more information in the absence of some factual basis for suspicion. Though these cases have been controversial, there were two previous arrests in 2009 of Michael Fitton and Hassam Samadi that used these techniques and actually resulted in both defendants literally pushing the button thinking that they would set off a bomb in the course of a sting operation. So when we talk about profiling, I think we should focus the conversation not on the laziest form of profiling and the most offensive, that is, blanket suspicion of a community, which does make us less safe, but rather, where does a profile fit in the context of legitimate investigative functions? Right now, as a country, we are in the midst of an era in which we're likely to see more extremism, more violence designed to disrupt the system on which we depend for our livelihood. Against such a backdrop, we must be sure to safeguard civil liberties, because it is all too easy to discard our cherished liberties in the name of security, but we also have to be attentive to what powers law enforcement needs to keep us safe. Extremism itself can be a potent threat to liberty, as much so as abuses by government. Just ask Molly Norris, the Seattle cartoonist who conceived of the Everybody Draw Muhammad Day after Comedy Central refused to air a picture of Muhammad on their hit show South Park, despite the fact that they showed on the same episode Buddha snorting cocaine and Jesus looking at internet pornography. After threats to her life, Molly Norris has disappeared, as though she never existed. Just ask Theo Van Gogh, who was brutally murdered on the streets of Amsterdam after producing a film critical of the treatment of women within Islam. And just ask Representative Giffords. This report asks important questions. It makes a solid contribution, but I'm unconvinced of its recommendations to decrease the FBI's investigatory power because I don't think it's carried its case. I think that this report actually would make us less safe, but because it doesn't acknowledge and balance that fact, I find it difficult to evaluate whether the proposals that it advances are indeed worth the cost. Thank you.
So it's often said that intelligent people of goodwill can disagree, and I'm very encouraged that at least so far there doesn't seem to be any disagreement about one of, I think, the core principles of the report, which is that blanket suspicion of entire communities makes us less safe and shreds the Constitution. And so if there's anything to take away from the panel, it would seem to be that the FBI's policies, at least in that particular dimension, are indefensible. I will note, at the risk of being self-indulgent, that the FBI is not here despite being invited and at one point planning to attend. I think their inability to justify appearing in public to actually defend these policies against a thoughtful critique is, quite frankly, reflective of the indefensibility of those underlying policies. Another thing I'll just say at the outset here, but before digging into the weeds on some of this, is that none of this reflects, either the critique of the FBI or its defense, reflects a particularly either conservative or progressive political viewpoint. What we're talking about here are ultimately divisions between what I would characterize as an American perspective and a Soviet perspective. And the unfortunate reality is that the FBI has been operating for the last 3 years under a Soviet model. And that might be discomforting, but at least the last time I checked, we won the Cold War. I thought it was very interesting to hear the example of the Cold War era nuclear scientist from Iraq. And when you look at the Cold War, the dominant narrative that leaps out at me is that we chose liberty. And that does not seem particularly apparent when you examine the FBI guidelines or the DIOG, or for that matter, FBI abuses under the Patriot Act. David mentioned this concern about restricting information from agents who might need it, right? There's the concern that over-inclusion of information, inundating analysts doesn't help, and I think the counterpoint is that, well, not having enough information can also be problematic. Let's just be real here. No one's talking about restricting the information available to the FBI. That's not the proposal. The proposal is to subject intrusive investigative techniques to a judicial warrant. And that should not be controversial in a country where the Fourth Amendment is part of our constitutional commitment. Quite frankly, I would say that the Constitution places that question off the table. I mean, the FBI policy that is in place, it shouldn't even be up for discussion, let alone the governing law of the land, especially at this sensitive a time. Just to press on the overcollection point, 2 examples I can indicate or offer here that indicate the concern. The underwear bomber from December 25th, I think it was 2009, was flagged to U.S. authorities by his own father. The scout of the Mumbai attacks was flagged to U.S. authorities by his wife. It is because there are vast reams of information beyond what any enterprise can thoughtfully assimilate that these sorts of reports, tips and leads, get lost. If tips and leads are being lost while we're dedicating our investigative resources to witch hunts, there is a problem, right? We should at least be dealing with the information that we're getting through legitimate measures. When people's family members are reporting information, I would like to see FBI agents following up those leads rather than presuming suspicion of entire communities and then infiltrating them. The other thing I'll note, David mentioned Nidal Hassan and a right-wing extremist with whose case I was previously unfamiliar. I would just note that each of those individuals would be certainly apt for investigation under a set of guidelines that required individualized suspicion, right? No one's saying that the FBI shouldn't be allowed to investigate cases where there is some basis for reasonable suspicion of criminal activity. Lawyers in the room will be familiar with that's the long-established Fourth Amendment standard for searches and seizures. The concern here is precisely that the FBI requires neither evidence nor even suspicion to employ its most intrusive investigative tactics. And let's not lose sight of the history here. The reason there is a set of FBI guidelines at all is that 40 years ago, the Bureau was engaged in a wholesale, what the Church Committee, Committee of the Senate, called a sophisticated vigilante operation aimed squarely at suppressing the legitimate exercise of First Amendment rights. And we are not as far removed from that history as we might care to think, especially when looking at the latest form of the guidelines, the Mukasey guidelines from 2008, essentially invite COINTELPRO again. And for particular communities, it remains very much in play, not just Muslim Americans, which I think is certainly one community that feels certainly very much at risk, the very week of the report that Representative Holt referenced, discussing many cases, actually, of political surveillance by the FBI. That very week, the Bureau served subpoenas on a series of peace activists across the Midwest who were being hauled before secret grand juries to testify about what, until last spring, was First Amendment protected activity. And so, you have the peace community, you have Muslims, Arabs, South Asians, environmentalists for the last decade, quite frankly, have been presumptively criminalized by the FBI. If you go to the communications management units where terrorism defendants are held in Marion, Illinois, and Terre Haute, Indiana, you'll find a great many Muslims. And the other community that will be particularly represented are radical environmentalists. And so you see an impact on particular pockets of civil society of these intrusive investigative techniques. And the point here is that they don't achieve security, both because they destroy opportunities to collect useful human intelligence and because they inundate analysts with trivial information. But then you also, on the other side, the side that we in the Cold War decided was more important, liberty, have demonstrably eviscerated, I would say, civil society organizing that, again, is constitutionally protected. And I think the commitment to counterproductive security measures and authorities for the FBI would certainly fall in the face of those far more pressing concerns. Just a couple other pieces. It does strike me as surprising to hear the reference to Representative Giffords in the closing portion of David's remarks, only because it seems to me that case, if anything, would suggest that the FBI is grossly negligent in the use of its resources. If Midwestern peace activists are being harassed and mosques around the country are being infiltrated, how are actual threats of actualized political violence not being addressed? I mean, that seems to me to be a gross manifestation of incompetence, and if anything, a quite stunning indictment of the Bureau's activities. And I think that brings to the fore all the more the recommendation for more aggressive congressional oversight, both of the uses of these authorities and their results. Just a couple more pieces to press on. Representative Holt suggested that we need to teach FBI agents about the distinction between false positives and base rates. Unfortunately, there are a great many things we need to teach FBI agents. One of them, going from I think this was July 28th last year, Senate Judiciary Committee hearing, one of the strands coming out of this hearing of criticism was that FBI agents had been found to be cheating on tests about the limits of their own powers under these guidelines. And I think that obviously is problematic. And a reflection on that hearing that did not receive quite as much attention is that the director himself failed the test on camera, right? So asked by Senator Durbin about the use of race in the use of intrusive investigative techniques, Director Mueller claimed that while evidence was not required, suspicion was. And it's interesting because then after the cameras are off and after the microphones are turned off, the FBI sends a letter to Senator Durbin saying, oh, no, sorry, that was just a mistake. We don't need evidence or suspicion. And I would just ask you to think carefully about what distinguishes that position from COINTELPRO. The only distinction I can contrive, if I were inclined to be charitable to the Bureau, is that in COINTELPRO they were quite intentional about abusing these authorities, whereas now perhaps it's just incidental. That doesn't seem to me to be a particularly compelling reason to resuscitate the case for maintaining them. Especially when this branch of the government is called on to exercise a constitutional responsibility for oversight. Last thing I'll just say here with respect to the warrant requirement and the idea of a judicial check, particularly on the use of intrusive investigative techniques, we have a choice as to whether or not the Fourth Amendment is a merely formalistic textual rejection of searches and seizures, or if, as our country evolved from the time of the founding, the development of even more intrusive government scrutiny measures like surveillance, like undercover infiltration, like warrantless wiretapping, whether or not those should be subject to the same protections. And the idea that they are not, quite frankly, to me, it ignores every conceivable basis for constitutional interpretation, because the founders would quite frankly be aghast at these kinds of activities, right? I mean, make no mistake, infiltrating an activist group, planting an agent provocateur who in many cases then attains a level of leadership and coordinates the group, on the basis of some abstract fear that someone else who shared a similar political predisposition might have been inclined toward violence. It gets to the point that Emily raised about the increasingly attenuated link behind the underlying circumstances and the investigative techniques. If there was one point I'd leave you with, it is that the FBI today claims no need for any factual predicate at all to justify its operations. And I would just ask, to think about what country we live in. I mean, the last I checked, this is the USA and not the USSR.
Thank you, and I think it's fair to say we got a divergence of perspectives here in the panel. We'll throw it open for discussion in a little bit, but just to start out, it's a bit unfortunate, I guess, that Valerie Caproni, the General Counsel for the FBI, couldn't make it here today because it would be interesting to hear how she would respond to some of the comments were made. But I did try to anticipate a little bit about what she might have said if she were here by taking a look at some testimony she gave to the Senate Intelligence Committee in September 2008 as these guidelines were about to be formulated, the Mukasey guidelines. And one of the arguments, or one of the explanations she gave, and this is one that FBI officials were giving broadly at the time, is, look, these aren't as big a deal as some of the critics are suggesting. What we're doing is making these guidelines for various kinds of investigations uniform, so that therefore what we are allowing in national security investigations goes no further than what we have allowed for many years in general criminal investigations. And just quoting from her testimony, I'm going to read it, a little passage, and then ask Emily, you to respond to this. As an example, how the prior guidelines treated comparable activities differently based on how those activities were categorized, consider the question of what the FBI can do in public places. Under the multiple guidelines regime, the rules were different if the FBI received a tip that a building was connected to organized crime, as opposed to a tip that the building was connected to a national security matter, such as international terrorist activities. The rules for how long the FBI could sit outside the building, or whether the FBI could follow someone exiting the building down the street, were different, specifically more restrictive on the national security side and difficult to apply. It makes no sense that the FBI should be more constrained in investigating the gravest threats to the nation than it is in criminal investigations generally. What's wrong with what Valerie Caproni was offering as the explanation for these guidelines?
Well, it's interesting you bring that up, because I've often been baffled by that example and similar ones, because organized crime, obviously, is a crime, but so is international terrorism. And so any one of those investigations, whether it's following up on a tip about a racketeering organization or following up on a tip on a national security risk, it could be conceived of as either a criminal investigation or as a national security and intelligence collection investigation. And the difference between those two over the years has always been that criminal investigations extend a little bit more power to the FBI because they're sort of naturally constrained by the investigation into the various elements of the crime that they're investigating. Whereas intelligence operations are more sprawling and more easily sort of get out of hand, and mission creep becomes an issue. And so I would argue that there are very good reasons for having distinct rules for criminal investigations versus intelligence investigations, and if there's sufficient evidence that there's a threat to national security, then there's no reason the FBI couldn't open that investigation as a criminal investigation and have all the powers that are available to it when it's going after the mob.
And I think what Valerie Caproni might say in response, or others, is, well, that's great, but particularly in the kinds of threats that the FBI is trying to deal with today, it's very difficult to know when that threshold is met. And if you look at some of the more prominent cases that Congressman Holt, no doubt you're familiar with through the Intelligence Committee, self-radicalized individuals in the United States who may not necessarily have had connections with organized terrorist groups outside the country, but on the internet become persuaded that they want to engage in terrorist activities. And Congressman, I'm going to ask you to talk about this. Look at the Little Rock shooting in 2009, or even Fazil Shahzad in the Times Square bombing. These were people who might have traveled abroad, but not necessarily had engaged in criminal activity. How is the FBI supposed to uncover individuals like that if they can't have more latitude in snooping, for lack of a better word, into what they are doing before they actually set off a bomb or shoot people at a recruitment center?
Well, I should have prefaced all my remarks by saying, I'm neither a forensic investigator nor a lawyer. I do play one on C-SPAN, and I've thought about this a lot. And it seems to me the examples that you talk about raise greater questions for whether the FBI can ever be appropriately structured to deal with intelligence matters than it does with whether they should be using different techniques. There's no question that whether it's organized criminals or some of their traditional targets are no less devious, ruthless, and difficult targets than some international terrorists. In fact, there are a number of cases that we've seen now in recent years of international would-be terrorists who are pretty bumbling. So that you might argue that the run-of-the-mill traditional targets of the FBI are tougher targets. The difference comes in the scale of I think, or so the argument would go among my colleagues here, in the scale of the damage that could be done. And so that, we've crossed over into a new era where new techniques are required because of the scale of the damage that can be done by international terrorists. I think we need to look at that argument very closely. It was accepted without challenge in 2001, 2002, 2003. It was I think, a basis for the Patriot Act, that there were terrorist cells in our midst, or could be. But of course, there have been would-be terrorists in our midst for as long as the country has existed. So I would like us to examine now what we failed to examine then, is the premises for the Patriot Act, for example. And I think your question, at least in my mind, raises that more than it does what you were trying to raise.
Well, if I hear you correctly, what you're saying is that perhaps the threat of terrorism that we have been concerned about certainly since 9/11 is overblown, is not as serious as was thought to be at the time.
Don't put those words in my mouth, please. That's not what I meant.
Tell me
Yes.
what. Tell me the difference between what you said and what I said is, and please explain.
There are mean, what I said is we really have to ask ourselves, what is it about the terrorist threat that has led us to change, I think, the foundation for our investigative and preventive activities. I mean, you know, using collection to prevent crimes, for example, which was something that Emily talked about. This has become a primary role of the FBI. It was maybe an incidental role previously. And so how are they to prevent crimes? Through intimidation or through such exhaustive collection that it confuses the target before it confuses themselves? Or through dragnets, you know, every suspicious person on a corner just because it's a bad neighborhood. There is crime in this neighborhood, somebody's standing on the corner, therefore we should investigate them. You know, it seems to me that we've gotten into a set of laws and now procedures that are based on poorly examined premises.
David, I'd like to ask you to respond to some of what congressmen have had to say, but before I do, just a sort of question for you. One of the things that these guidelines have done is allow, as I understand it, FBI agents or informants to sit in mosques without identifying themselves and collect information. Would you, about who's attending and what's being said, would you acknowledge that were that to become known within any house of worship that a government informant was spying on a place of worship, that could have an intimidating effect?
Yes.
Do you think it ought to be permitted?
I think it depends. I mean, I really can't answer that question straight up because, as I said with the very first example I gave, context matters. So are we talking about the Bridgeview Mosque in Illinois where a large amount of fundraising for Hamas was done? Are we talking about that place of worship or just a random mosque? Placing an informant in a random mosque just to see what's happening there, I'm against.
But isn't that what these guidelines essentially allow the FBI to do, to do assessments of a mosque without having the predicate that mosque is raising money and sending it to a terrorist organization?
Yes, that's my reading of it. And look, I think that just let's separate two things out here. I mean, one is the assessment, second is the placing of an informant. And granted, I mean, none of us disagree that in the assessment phase right now, the FBI can place an informant to check out how things are going down. Perhaps that's something that needs to change. As I said, I'm not here as a shill for the FBI. I'm here as a thinker. And that's something that I think that's one of the more problematic aspects of what's allowed. We don't have the full information on what happened in California. The infamous incident where an informant was placed within a mosque and he was the local mosque leadership went to the FBI and said, there's this guy trying to stir things up. He proved to be an informant. The informant then went south, held his own press conference. The kind of thing that if you're working in the FBI, you never want to see happen. I don't know the full context as to why he was placed there, but it's the kind of thing that intuitively, it seems that something went horribly wrong. And, look, that's one of the things which I think is one of the clearer arguments. As I said at the outset, I'm not against everything in this report, and in particular, some of the oversight recommendations strike me as being good ideas to undertake. That also might be another reform that I would agree with. My only hesitation comes down again to the initial thing that I said, which is context. I don't know the full context as to how they're using it, but it does strike me as perhaps a place for good reform.
Okay. Sheeta, I just want to ask you a little bit about some of your remarks, given that you were perhaps more critical even than the congressman or Emily in her report, and in which you sort of suggested, and tell me if if you think I'm misstating this, that what the FBI is now allowed to do is substantively really no different than what it was doing during COINTELPRO, which led to the Church Committee. And of course, what it was doing was during COINTELPRO was far more than information collection. It was provoking crimes. It was, I mean, they were writing anonymous letters to Martin Luther King and others to try to incite them and try to get them to do things that they could then catch them on. Do we have anything comparable from what the FBI has done since 9/11 that remotely is in that category of inciting, creating crimes that reach that level?
Unfortunately, yes, and I could quite frankly rattle off cases for you. So,
okay, please cite
two.
one or two
Yeah.
that you think resembles the COINTEL excesses of the Church Committee.
Sure, so one of them actually David just raised, and that's the case in Southern California. Craig Montiel is the name of the FBI informant who then blew a whistle on being paid $100,000 in taxpayer money to essentially bribe unsophisticated people into participating in the plots that he would initiate. And that instance there shows a great many things. First, the resiliency of the American Muslim community against this sort of extremism, because what happened in each of the mosques that this person went to, they went to the LAPD and they went to the FBI to tell them that there's this guy talking about violence in our mosque who turns out to be an FBI informant. Another coda to that story that's particularly interesting to me, one of the individuals who came forward to report violence was himself later prosecuted because he supposedly lied to a federal agent, and the lie was an omission when asked about the times that he had left the country for international travel. The two most common charges in the counterterrorism context are lying to a federal official and material support for terrorism. Material support is, much like the AG guidelines, horrifically attenuated. You know, there's a case of a guy who's serving a 15-year sentence now, Muslim American peace activist, a student in New York, and the extent of his material support was that somebody stayed at his house who borrowed his cell phone, shows up in Afghanistan with a pair of socks that he'd lent him. And that supposedly is material support for terrorism. You know, the case that before the Supreme Court last spring that rendered speech criminal in this context and exposed essentially every peace activist who does any solidarity work, either with Colombia or Palestine, to these sorts of investigations, was about a case where a charity was trying to promote nonviolent conflict resolution in Turkey. And that somehow became material support for terrorism. So unfortunately, the shoe does fit much better than I think we would hope. Another case, you asked for two, the Newburgh Fort, Newburgh, New York. You have an agent there. Similarly, not an agent, pardon me, an informant, a repeat informant who had infiltrated other mosque communities as well, similarly sent in with a six-figure budget. Among the four people that over the course of a year are basically mobilized and recruited for the plot that the FBI agent initiated were a heroin addict and a schizophrenic. And the idea, two things about that case jump out at me. One, the idea that mere mental instability precludes terrorism, and you've heard this a lot in the wake of the attacks in Arizona, quite frankly, it doesn't fly. And it's never flown before. The FBI prosecutes lots of crazy people who happen to be Muslim as terrorists. And the second thing about that case that particularly galls me is that those individuals could not conceivably have had the capacity to envision, fund, and execute that plot. It was entirely driven by agents provocateur, and I'm sorry to say that I think that that is more the rule than the exception. The last thing I'll say on this, that the Justice Department Inspector General has recommended the appointment of a special prosecutor to review these cases involving undercover infiltration and surveillance precisely because of Sixth Amendment violations and the failure by prosecutors to disclose to defense counsel exculpatory evidence. That is to say, all the things that these people say that gets captured on tape that would go to show their innocence. And I think there is, quite frankly, an ongoing travesty of relatively magnificent proportions. And I think your question was quite apt, and I think that really goes to the heart of these problems.
Just to follow up on that, you say that the Inspector General has recommended the appointment of a special counsel to investigate. Where does that stand? Has a special counsel been appointed?
I don't think the Justice Department has taken up that recommendation. There are other cases, too. I mean, I could go on a list where the department has failed to execute IG recommendations. You were talking about the FBI, which happens also to be the principal agency to implement Patriot Act powers. A litany of powers under the Patriot Act have been abused systematically. The IG reported in 2006, 2008, and again in 2010 about pervasive and systemic abuses of national security letters, the authority for which was expanded under the Patriot Act, and there hasn't been any reform there either. So if there is a consensus on the panel around the need for more oversight, I would just hope that that could really come through this panel loud and clear and hopefully find its way into some meaningful action.
That is not part of the expiring
It is not.
legislation, unfortunately.
It is not. Though I would say the whole thing's on the table, right? I mean, if Congress were to see fit to act to actually defend the Constitution, I think there are a great many problems, both in Patriot and FISA and elsewhere, that could be fixed.
Yes.
I think we should open it up, but on the subject of oversight, I'll interject one interesting editorial comment. One of the 9/11 Commission's recommendations was that there be a Privacy and Civil Liberties Board be created to look at precisely these issues. And this is a subject that got some attention during the Bush years, much like a lot of the things we're talking about. And in fact, Congress decided that the presidentially appointed Privacy and Civil Liberties Board didn't have sufficient independence, passed legislation to create a statutorily independent one, and then there was some criticism in the last year or so of the Bush administration that President Bush never actually appointed members to that Privacy and Civil Liberties Board, so it sat vacant. Well, here we are well into the second year of the Obama administration, and we still do not have a Privacy and Civil Liberties Board. Just in the last month, we had 2 appointees to the 5-member board, so even were they to get confirmed by the Senate in a rapid fashion, not likely, they would still not be able to convene because there wouldn't be a quorum, because the President did not appoint a chairman. But I was interested to see that one of the 2 appointees was a Republican recommended by Senator McConnell, a former lawyer at the Justice Department, Elizabeth Collins Cook, who has the distinction of having been one of the authors of the FBI guidelines that we are discussing. So when it comes to independent oversight, that will be an interesting issue if the Civil Liberties Board ever gets up and running. In any case,
I have a legislative interest in this, having helped write that, but you have covered it very well, so there's nothing to say.
In any case, I think we have microphone over here, so if somebody would like to ask a question so everybody can hear, step over there.
Thank you so much for this panel. It's really great to listen to this. My name is Tyg Berry. I'm with an organization called Code Pink. I've been to Gaza many times over the last couple of years. I've given material aid in the form of playgrounds to the children of Hamas. I've brought 1,000 gift baskets to women after the massacre took place in Gaza, Palestine. And my own congressman, Brad Sherman, has called for people like me to be tried as aiding and abetting terrorists and maybe even given the death penalty. How do you feel about that, Mr. Gartenstein-Ross? Do you think that's appropriate?
First of all, you're not going to be given the death penalty. Material support is not a capital crime. Second, I don't know what you did there, so I cannot say. I can say that aid that goes to Hamas, which is a terrorist organization that kills not just Israelis, but also other Palestinians, and I've known Palestinians whose shops have been burned down by Hamas because they're Christian. Money that goes to Hamas is fungible, highly fungible. Hamas's entire charity network allows it to be a very potent force in that area. I do think that there's a reason for the material support statutes, yes. I mean, I don't know what you did. I'm not going to say that you should be prosecuted, nor do I even know that Brad Sherman called for it. I know for a fact that it's not a capital crime, so the last rhetorical flourish was just that, a flourish.
Could I say one thing on material support while the question's on this?
Already.
Just wanted to point out an exchange between Professor David Cole, who teaches not far from here, and a number of people. We've talked about the Mukasey guidelines, right? That's the discrete subject of the panel. So Attorney General Mukasey, along with Rudy Giuliani and former Homeland Security Secretary Tom Ridge, all spoke in late December of last year at a rally in Paris supporting the Mujahideen al-Khalq, I suppose is how you say it. And this is a, say again? Khalq, thank you. I appreciate that. It's been designated by the Office of Foreign Asset Control as a terrorist organization for a decade. So you see in the material support standard, and in particular, and I appreciate your focus on context, you see a profound unwillingness to apply the law equally to different parties who are similarly situated. And I think that really goes to the, again, the heart of what we're talking about.
Which is entirely untrue. Actually, Mukasey and the others wrote a column that went into David Cole's piece. David Cole is someone who believes that there's a First Amendment right to support terrorist organizations. I have deep, deep disagreements with him. But in this particular case, as Mukasey and others pointed out, what they were doing was speaking in support of MEK, Mujahideen-e-Khalq, being undesignated. They weren't providing them with material support. There's no way that they would be prosecuted for that, nor is there any way that anybody else speaking in support of MEK, speaking in support of Hamas or others, saying they should be de-designated, would be prosecuted. That is not material support. That's First Amendment protected activity. I understand your...
Not to dwell on this, but please distinguish, Mukasey and the others did fly over to Paris. And
on their own
speak
dime.
at a rally. Right. And speaking out in favor of de-designating the MEK, how is that distinguished from the Supreme Court case that David Cole was involved in?
Because the Supreme Court case talks about giving them actual functional aid, i.e. telling them how to negotiate. I mean, that's ultimately what the issue is framed as, is that PKK wants to end their violent struggle. And so they have to be given humanitarian law considerations. Now, look, one thing I should make clear on is I'm not necessarily supporting that particular decision. And the reason why is because I have friends who work for ICRC, the International Committee for the Red Cross, who saw that as a very important decision, and one where one thing ICRC sees as important is being able to train terrorist organizations in international humanitarian law in order to make civilians safer in areas that are battlefield areas. So without supporting that decision, what that involved was actual support to an organization which trained it in specific techniques. Speaking out in favor of an organization, as David Cole does all the time, is not something you'll get prosecuted for. And David Cole is well aware of that. He's a smart enough guy that he understood that what his New York Times column was a cheap shot. It's not an actual legal argument.
Well, if David Cole were here, I'd ask him to respond, but he's not, so the next question.
Hi. My name is Li Yang. I've been in the United States since the mid-60s. And I have experienced a lot and practically sacrificed all my everything, property, constitutional rights, in your jury trial right, and due process right, grievance right, whatever. And I've been participating in many civil organizations, and I support Congress and hold verified voting. And I've been lobbying many times, like public interest groups, public citizens or consumer unions, and so on. So I'm not really saying the guideline will be very effective to us, the FBI or law enforcement, which I include police or sheriff or court personnel or legal judicial system, because they are in the same game. And what I'm about to say, from the beginning, they can take your passport, they can maybe pretend like a contractor or impersonator, take your passport away.
Do you
And
have,
now
do
you
you have a
bring-
question for
A question, yeah, I just give you a little bit introduction in a sense, so you understand, for these 40 years, how do they take away all my rights, all my participation or civic or political activities, And all my property, whether it's my home or my car or my belonging or the house or everything, they can take it away. What that means, I'm not before payment in foreclosure. Instead, they can take away my house. Instead, they can run my car. And in fact, they can conspire with health services agencies, government agencies, and private hospitals
Excuse
together.
me, I'm not hearing a question.
My question is, can you really incorporate my complaint, whether it's administrative or judicial level? I have identified the problems. We have to build in those problems and identify us as FBI really investigate those and get rid of those bad apples and the related network.
Thank you. I guess I would take your very presence here in the Rayburn building as exercising your right to petition government for redress of grievances.
Right.
It sounds like you have a long list of grievances, and I thank you for bringing them out.
Yeah.
The next,
Yeah,
we have
just
two
take a look
more.
at the vote to Maryland MD. My name will be there as a candidate since 1994. Last year, I ran for the U.S. Senate too.
We have two more, time for, I think, two more questions, is that right?
Hi, I'm Samira Daniels. I have a great interest in investigatory techniques and so forth, and I appreciated Representative Holt's raising the issue of, the problem of these investigative techniques, and I wondered how you think that is how do you think that is being addressed in any substantial way? You raised it in the very first part of your comments.
I'm not quite sure how to answer it. I mean, I do think, of course, there is much talk on all sides of these issues against, take profiling, for example. But I think very little hard thinking or study on why, again, taking the example of profiling, why it is not productive investigation. I mean, sure, there are lawbreakers and potential lawbreakers who use libraries. And of course, there are terrorists who are Muslim. But I mean, I think the really hard thinking about how you get beyond our personal fallacies of reason
Belief, yeah.
is not taking place.
Hello, my name is Susan Harmon. I'm with Code Pink and Progressive Democrats of America. I want to, thinking of examples, for instance, the Ninth Circuit in California where I live just decided that it's okay for the FBI, I think it was the FBI, to put a GPS device secretly on your car to track you, an appalling decision as far as I'm concerned. And Shahid, maybe you know that whole Seattle case recently where the infiltrator provided everything to the would-be bomber, I mean, including salary and keeping them from moving to Canada. I mean, that just seemed like it was entirely the FBI's plot. So with those in the background, I'm concerned about a much more fundamental issue, and that's why we distinguish between crime and terrorism. The examples that I'm particularly concerned about are the totally illegal military commissions going on in Guantanamo. Why I think that this is sort of a PR issue, but I think that they illegitimately and unfortunately elevate real criminals, and there are a few at Guantanamo, not many, to some heroic military status. They're heroes when they are simply common criminals, the ones that actually did something. So I think across the board, I am terrified by all this war on terror. I think it's meant to cow our population and make us afraid. And I would urge eliminating the whole distinction between crime and terror.
Congressman, why don't you
Well,
handle
I-
that one?
I
And
believe-
also,
I-
if you could, just address the issue of military commissions versus civilian
Yeah.
trials, because that one is looming quite large.
Yeah, I haven't resolved that and probably can't resolve that question right here. I think that it is possible to draw a meaningful distinction between crime and international terrorism. What concerns me is that there is so much in between, and the balance has, and the change of mind that occurred after 2001 was a dramatic shift to put almost everything in the international terrorism category. And and I think that, well, that's what I was trying to say earlier, that I think that, there are very few, except occasionally in law school, I think, are there really cut and dried examples on the extremes. Most of what the FBI deals with, most of what we should be considering when we legislate, is all of that in between. All the examples that Shahid has referred to, I think, are, arrests made in the United States of Americans never on a battlefield that were engaged in radical thinking and potentially dangerous actions, but it's really not clear where, it's not clear to me where they are on the spectrum, and real damage can be done if we just put them all in the international terrorism basket. Maybe you can explain it better.
I thought you captured it, absolutely. And I think the real, two fears, just to draw it back to the report, one is damaging community trust, because if there are some number of people who present potential concerns, then the behavioral profiling within communities of potential interest, I think, is legitimate, right? That's different than blanket suspicion. And I think the other piece is inundating analysts and intelligence professionals with a mountain of false leads. And that's something that, intelligence professionals have complained about before. And I think that policymakers should keep that in mind.
Although, just to be clear, Congressman, Fazil Shahzad, the Times Square bomber, did go to Pakistan.
That's true.
Did,
That's true.
we
Get
are
some
told,
training. We're told
get training
get some
from
training.
the TTP. Zazi, who attempted the 9/11 anniversary bombing in the New York area, had been to Afghanistan. And so there was a international nexus in some of the more disturbing cases that we've seen over the last couple of years.
And virtually, maybe without exception, the detainees in Guantanamo had international presence of some
Well,
sort.
yeah, they all came from.
They all came from abroad.
Abroad.
That's right, yes.
Right. Yes.
Hi, Liza Goiting from the Brennan Center. I have a question for Emily, and I promise that we did not rehearse this beforehand, and she has no idea what I'm about to ask her. You can tell by her face. My question is, you've been talking about the ineffectiveness of the approach of indiscriminate intelligence collection or intelligence collection that's targeted by ethnicity or religion, that these are ineffective techniques. And I'm worried about leaving the impression that the FBI is basically powerless to deal with prevention of terrorist crimes. And, the example of Fazil Shahzad, pardon my pronunciation, has come up a couple of times. The fact that a terrorist incident almost occurred does not necessarily tell you that anything's wrong with the powers we have. We can't, as you pointed out, expecting perfection is not reasonable, but assuming that there's something that could have been done, and assuming with that kind of case, and assuming that, random infiltration of mosques would not have caught him, which I think is a fair assumption, what sorts of techniques are reasonable for the FBI to be engaging in and are plausible and plausibly effective in dealing with the terrorist threat and trying to prevent terrorist activity?
I mean, I don't have any gripes with particular techniques per se. What I worry about is the permissiveness with which they may be used. So, you asked earlier if the FBI is not allowed to engage in these preventive intelligence collection like how are they going to keep us safe? I think it was an op-ed or an editorial in the Washington Post recently saying that 80% of the terrorist arrests and prosecutions within the United States were a result of tips from within the community, within the mosque, or wherever the person happened to be. And so I think if someone calls the FBI and says, there's someone in my mosque who's trying to recruit me to fire rocket-propelled grenades at airplanes at JFK, then the FBI would be well within its rights to follow up on that. So I think it's more a matter of deciding, what needs to happen before a particular power is exercised. And I think it's always going to be somewhat of a judgment call, which is why I think eliminating the requirement that agents get supervisory approval before engaging in some of these tactics is problematic. I think that's why oversight is so important. These are powerful tools and they should be used appropriately, but we should also have protections in place to be sure that they're not used inappropriately.
Let's say it's less than what you just postulated. It's not somebody calls up the FBI and says, there's a guy at my mosque trying to recruit me to shoot RPGs at JFK. Let's say somebody sees something on the internet about a guy at the mosque who's got RPGs and recruiting. You don't have a tipster who's got firsthand information. You've got some information out there on the internet. What should the FBI do?
I mean, I think in an instance like that, if someone's talking about the use of violence.
You don't know who it is. It's anonymous. It's an anonymous chat room on the internet.
I mean, I think if the FBI is alerted to someone talking plausibly about the use of violence, that they are well within their rights to follow up. And
no, but it's at the mosque.
the
There's no individuals named. There's somebody at the mosque who's doing it.
I mean,
Criminal investigation.
I mean, I think.
Yeah, all right. Shahid, you want to answer that question?
It does strike me that would at least create some reasonable suspicion. It wouldn't be individualized suspicion, which is where I think the rubber hits the road here, right? And there's also the burden on the First Amendment protected activity of the institution. I think I just go back to where Emily was at and say that's exactly why you need supervisory controls. That's exactly why you need oversight and an awareness of the context that David keeps reminding us is so very important. It is precisely the abdication of that sphere to agents who are allowed to run with their own biases, their own preconceived notions, without supervisory controls or checks or balances or a judicial warrant. That's the danger. And I just want to, I would go back to also what Representative Holt said earlier. None of us are forensic investigators, right? So we might not be the best people to ask that particular question, but I'm sensitive to the point, and I do think that there is room for investigative activities that are based on reasonable suspicion. And I just want to keep bringing us back to that piece, because that's what's been so dramatic.
Would you have a problem if the FBI sent an informant to the mosque?
In the hypo that you constructed, somebody sees online
Yeah.
a report that someone's got. I mean, if it's verifiable, if there are less intrusive techniques that can be used to verify that report, I think those would be useful to consider.
I think what you describe occurs by the thousands on the internet every day. If what you describe would not be, from my point of view, sufficient basis for infiltration or search and seizure.
Well, we're not talking about search and seizure. We're
Well-
talking about sending an
Well,
informant,
I mean,
opening up an assessment as to whether there's somebody at the mosque.
I mean, I think that there are lots of as you describe it, that it's not very compelling that there is much of anything going on. I mean, I assume you read the internet. I mean, you should see the emails I get.
Something other than the internet.
You
but,
should see the emails that I get. I mean, it's, and most of those are, are.
Just to wrap this up,
are
David, do
not
you have
particularized
your
in
perspective on my hypothetical?
Well, I mean, as everyone's noted, we don't have enough information to really make the judgment. If it seems credible, then yes, I'm okay with it. I think that if it's something that seems credible, you send an informant in the least intrusive way possible, and if it seems that nothing is up, that would be a good place to stop the investigation. I mean, if it's just some random posting like what people email to Representative Holt, that's clearly by an insane person, which is 90% of what you get in comment sections of the internet, then I would ignore it. But it depends on the credibility with which it's written. If it seems credible, then yes, my answer is yes.
Also, I would just like to add that before the assessments existed, the FBI would refer to the limited checking of leads, which was something that they could do before, when they didn't have enough evidence to open a predicated investigation. So it's not as if before assessments were created, agents were powerless to follow up on tips like that. What they were is more limited in the tactics that they could use. So maybe it makes sense for the FBI to spend some time in that chat room in a public space before going into the mosque and infiltrating. So I think the least intrusive method idea, I think, is an important one to keep in mind. Don't use those tools that are so intrusive when you might be able to accomplish the same thing another way.
We'll have a lot of FBI agents spending a lot of time in
Chat rooms.
In any case, I think that about wraps it up, and I want to thank everybody for participating in this discussion, and thank you all for coming.
Sorry. Oh, no, it's, but I want you to understand when I said that I was building a playground. That's what I meant. Yeah, and my